The first thing Gitsnatcher learned about prison was that it smelled exactly like the world outside, only more so. The air was a thick, greasy stew of unwashed orc, rust, damp earth, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. He learned this as he was thrown, head first through a jagged opening in a wall of crudely welded scrap metal, his world becoming a tumbling cacophony of grunts, snarls, and the deafening clang of the gate slamming shut behind him. His former mob, the Rusthoof Boys, had made their final opinion on his failed leadership abundantly clear. Disgrace was a stain best washed away by tossing the stained thing into a pit and forgetting about it. He landed hard on a floor of packed dirt and shattered teeth, the impact jarring his bones. Pushing himself up, he spat out a mouthful of grime and took in his new home. It was not a single cell, but a vast, cavernous enclosure, a ramshackle zoo of welded iron cages, leaning watchtowers and fenced-off pits, all cobbled together from the wreckage of looted vehicles and forgotten war machines. The entire structure groaned and shuddered as if alive, vibrating with the constant percussive rhythm of violence. Orcs were everywhere, a seething mass of green muscle and crude iron. They weren't just inmates. They were the architecture. They piled on top of one another in rusted cages, fighting for an extra inch of space, their brawls spilling out into the narrow trash-strewn pathways. In one corner, a massive orc used a smaller one as a club to beat a third into a pulpy mess. In another, a furious tug-of-war over a moldy-looking boot ended with the boot being torn in half and both parties turning their rage on each other. The noise was a physical force, a wall of sound composed of roaring engines, clanging metal, bestial bellows, and the wet, meaty thuds of fists meeting flesh. Gitsnatcher scrambled to his feet, his instinct screaming at him to find a wall to put his back against. There was no order, no system, only a raw. No system, only a raw, chaotic ecosystem, where the biggest and the meanest carved out their temporary kingdoms. He saw an orc with a crude metal hook for a hand casually rip a bar from a nearby cage and begin beating the occupant with it, not out of malice, but out of sheer bored aggression. This was the grimdark reality of orc justice. Imprisonment wasn't about rehabilitation or punishment. It was just a different, more concentrated form of the same violence that governed their entire existence. The only thing that had changed was the size of the cage. He was no longer a disgraced boss. He was just another piece of meat in the grinder, and the grinder was already turning, hungry, and relentless. The first lesson of survival came not with a roar, but with the scent of a half-rotten squid haunch. The greasy, fungal odor cut through the prison's general stench, a siren call that drew every orc in the vicinity. Gitsnatcher's stomach clenched with a primal hunger he hadn't felt since his fall from grace. He saw it, a gristly prize dropped by a careless guard high in the rusted gantries, tumbling end over end before landing in a patch of mud, not 10 feet away. For a single foolish second, he hesitated, his mind still clinging to the ghost of command, the idea that a boss could simply take what he wanted. That second nearly ended him. A hulking brute with a jaw full of iron spikes and one milky white eye lunged for the prize, his massive, knuckle-dusted hand closing around the bone. Gitsnatcher moved on instinct, a surge of pure survival reflex. He didn't charge, he ducked low, letting the bigger orc's momentum carry him forward, and drove his own thick skull upward into the brute's exposed armpit. There was a wet, popping sound. The one-eyed orc bellowed, his grip on the squig haunch faltering. Gitsnatcher didn't wait. He scrabbled in the mud, his fingers closing around the greasy bone, and rolled away just as a heavy boot stomped down where his head had been. He came up in a crouch, the haunch clutched to his chest, his back to a wall of corrugated iron. The one-eyed orc was clutching his now useless arms, snarling. But another, even larger orc was already stepping forward, drawn by the commotion and the promise of food.
This was the currency of the pit. Not teeth, not loyalty, not promises.
It was strength, immediate and brutal, and the aggression to spend it without a second thought. Gitsnatcher bared his own teeth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was outmatched, he knew it, but to show weakness was to be devoured. He prepared to sell his life for a single miserable bite. A rock, small but sharp, pinged off the larger orc's temple. It wasn't enough to hurt, but it wasn't enough to distract. The orc turned, roaring in the direction the rock had come from. In that sliver of an opening, a smaller, wiry orc darted from behind a pile of rusted barrels. He didn't look at Gitsnatcher, but gestured frantically with a grimy hand toward a gap between two leaning shacks. Gitsnatcher didn't question it. He ran, shoving the haunch into his mouth as he went, the foul taste of mold and dirt a feast fit for a king. He squeezed into the narrow gap, the larger orc's enraged bellows fading behind the scrap metal walls. He found the smaller orc waiting, pressed against the shadows, his beady eyes darting nervously. The orc was named Snotgob, a name that fit his perpetually dripping nose and scrawny frame. He watched Gitsnatcher finish the haunch, a flicker of something like respect in his gaze. When Gitsnatcher finally grunted a question, asking what the rules were in this madhouse, Snotgob let out a wet, snuffling laugh that held no humor. He explained, not with words of wisdom, but with a series of gestures and grunts that painted a perfectly clear picture. He pointed a grimy finger at Gitsnatcher, then at himself, then made a crushing motion with his hands. He gestured out toward the main yard, miming a big orc, smashing a little one. Then the little one getting up and smashing an even smaller one. There were no rules, Snotgob's pantomime declared. No laws, no codes of honor. There was only the simple, brutal hierarchy of size and fury. The big ones smashed the little ones because they could, and the only way to stop being one of the little ones was to get bigger, or get smarter, or find another little one to stand with, if only for a moment. It was a shaky alliance, born from a shared desire not to be at the very bottom of the pile, and Gitsnatcher understood. It was the only kind of deal he was going to get. The pounding of a massive, improvised gong echoed through the prison yard, a sound so deep and resonant it momentarily drowned out the constant brawling. It was a call to attention, not through any sense of discipline, but through sheer, overwhelming volume. Every orc, from the meanest bully to the lowliest scratcher, instinctively turned toward the source of the noise. Gitsnatcher, crouched beside Snotgob in their narrow alley, felt the vibration in his teeth. This was no random act of violence. This was a scheduled event. From the largest, most fortified shack at the center of the compound, a figure emerged that made the other hulking brutes look like scrawny runts. This was Big Boss Crump, the warden. He was a mountain of scarred, green muscle, so vast he had to turn sideways to fit through the doorway. One of his arms was a monstrous hydraulic claw, hissing and dripping black fluid, while the other ended in a fist the size of a wrecking ball. His jaw was a cage of iron tusks, and a single, blood-red eye glared from beneath a heavy, riveted brow. He climbed onto a dais of crushed vehicles, the metal groaning in protest under his weight. His speech began not with words, but with action. He scanned the crowd of prisoners, his red eye sweeping across them with bored contempt. It settled on a particularly loud orc who was busy trying to bite another's ear off. With a casual, almost lazy flick of his hydraulic claw, Crump extended it. The pincers shot out on a chain of rusted links, snatching the offending orc from the crowd. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a brief choked-off yell before Crump retracted the claw, holding the now limp body aloft for all to see. "Aye!" Crump bellowed, his voice like grinding rocks.
"Dis, sir, is order." He shook the corpse for emphasis, droplets of blood, and worse pattering down on the prisoners below. "Order means I'm the biggest."
Order means when I talk you a lot shut your go. To illustrate his point, he spotted another orc who had flinched at the spray of gore. He dropped the first body and stomped down from his platform, the ground shaking with each step.
He grabbed the second orc by the head and with a single brutal twist of his wrecking ball fist tore it clean from its shoulders. He held the head up, its expression frozen in surprise.
"See? Nice and quiet." Snatcher watched, a cold understanding settling in his gut.
This wasn't a system of justice or control. It was a performance.
The guards, who were now emerging from the shadows to laugh and cheer at their boss's display, weren't enforcers of some higher law. They were just the biggest, meanest orcs in the pit, the ones Crump had either beaten into submission or bribed with the best scraps.
They wore bits of mismatched armor and carried heavy mauls not as symbols of authority, but as the biggest, shiniest toys. They were enjoying this. They relished the absolute power to crump anyone, anytime, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Crump continued his speech, punctuating every other bellowed word about discipline and respect by randomly pulverizing another prisoner.
He wasn't trying to teach a lesson or instill fear. He was simply demonstrating the pinnacle of orc logic. Might made right.
Power was its own justification. The bizarre circular reasoning was laid bare. The strongest orc was in charge because he was the strongest, and his only rule was a reminder of that. Fact. There was no crime, no punishment. Only a perpetual violent pecking order with Crump at the very top, enjoying the view, and occasionally reaching down to pluck off a morsel for his amusement.
Snatcher looked at Snotgob, whose face was pale with a terror that was entirely rational. This was the law of the land, and the warden was its living, breathing, and brutally illogical embodiment. The new day did not arrive with a gentle dawn, but with the sound of a skull cracking against the metal wall beside Snatcher's head. He jerked awake, the instinct for survival already honed to a razor's edge.
Sleep was a fragile, fleeting thing in the pit, stolen in minutes between eruptions of violence, the gray, perpetual twilight that passed for daylight in the cavernous enclosure, revealed two orcs locked in a death struggle over a puddle of murky water, their fight having spilled into the narrow alley where he and Snotgob had taken refuge.
This was the morning bell, the universal alarm.
Clock of the prison, the wet, percussive rhythm of someone else's bad day. Snatcher scrambled back, pulling his knees to his chest as the brawling pair grunted and snarled, rolling through the muck.
There was no purpose to it, no grand prize. It was simply the default state of being, the endless, arena-like violence that defined existence.
He exchanged a weary glance with Snotgob. The smaller orc was already awake, his beady eyes scanning the alley's entrance for the next threat.
Their alliance, though born of necessity, had already settled into a grim routine of shared vigilance. The primary objective of the day, as with every day, was sustenance.
The memory of the squig haunch was a distant, tantalizing dream. Real food was a myth.
That quarry was the thick, phosphorescent mold that grew in the dampest, most neglected corners of the prison, feeding on rust and spilled blood. They moved through the yard like ghosts, keeping to the shadows of leaning scrap heaps and the undersides of gantries. The main thoroughfares were a gauntlet of casual brutality, where a stray elbow or a misinterpreted glance could earn a beating from an orc 3 times your size. They navigated a landscape of perpetual conflict, a churning sea of green flesh, where temporary mobs formed and dissolved in the time it took to win or lose a fight. The true danger, however, was not the general chaos but the organized part of it.
The patrols. The guards, emboldened by their status and their heavy mauls, roamed in packs. Their boredom, a more potent weapon than their cruelty.
They didn't patrol to prevent crime. They patrolled to create it. Gitsnacha watched from a hiding spot as a trio of them descended on a lone orc who was trying to sharpen a shard of metal on a rock. There were no questions, no accusations. One guard kicked the rock away. Another smashed the orc's hands with his maul. And the third laughed uproariously before delivering a final, crushing blow to the head. They left the body. Where it fell, a new landmark in the yard, a warning that was also an invitation. Avoiding these patrols was a delicate dance of timing and terror. The day's main event was a crude competition staged near the center of the yard. A massive rusted fuel drum had been set upright, its open top a gaping maw.
2 orcs were shoved into the circle by laughing gods. The game was simple: be the last one standing outside the drum. What followed was not a skilled fight, but a clumsy, desperate shoving match. The larger orc quickly gained the advantage, grabbing his opponent by the belt and neck, heaving him toward the rim.
For a moment, the smaller orc dangled, his feet kicking at empty air, a look of pure animal panic on his face. Then, with a final, grunting shove, he was gone. A second of silence was followed by a wet, final crunch from the depths of the drum. The winner raised his arms, not in triumph, but in relief, only to be immediately set upon by another challenger, eager for his spot. The drum was a mouth that never closed, a bottomless pit that consumed the weak and the unlucky, emphasizing the endless cyclical nature of the violence. There was no winning, only a temporary postponement of being thrown into the dark.
Gitsnacha turned away, the spectacle leaving a cold hollow in his chest. This was a typical day. This was life. The promise of a truly epic crumping was a siren song that could silence even the most dedicated brawler. It began as a low, rhythmic pounding, not from the usual gong, but from 100 orc fists hammering on scrap metal in unison. The sound built, a thunderous war drum that vibrated through the very foundations of the prison, shaking rust from the ceiling and mud from the floor. Every fight stopped mid-swing. Every snarl died in 100 throats.
All eyes burning with a mixture of dread and feverish anticipation turned toward Big Boss Crump's central dais. Gitsnacha felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his stomach.
This was not a random display of power. This was the announcement of a spectacle. Crump emerged, not with his usual bored contempt, but with a wide, tusked grin that was more terrifying than any scowl. He held up his hydraulic claw, and the pounding ceased, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. "Listen!" roared, his voice booming across the suddenly still yard. "I'm bored. Bored of watching you lot scrape over moldy fundus and puddles." He gestured with his massive wrecking ball fist toward the far end of the compound, where a vast open area was usually littered with broken machinery and the skeletons of old vehicles. "So we're having a proper fight, d'ye scrappy ape?" "All of ya! Last orc stand gets. Well, he gets to not get crumped by me. And Ed gets this." With a clatter of chains, 2 of his guard bullies dragged a massive, still-sizzling haunch of some enormous beast into the light. The smell, rich and meaty and utterly alien in this place of rot and decay, hit the crowd like a physical blow. A collective hungry gasp rippled through the prisoners. It was more than food. It was a symbol of a different world, a prize of unimaginable worth. "Everyone fights," Crump bellowed, his red eye gleaming with manic joy. No sides, no mows, no Iden, just one big, beautiful mess. Any jit I find I didn't know gets fed to their squigs. Now get ready. It starts when the bell rings. The yard exploded into a frenzy, but not of fighting. It was a frenzy of preparation. Orcs scrambled, not away from each other, but to find anything that could serve as a weapon, a sharpened piece of rebar, a length of chain, a rock that fit nicely in the hand. The temporary truce of the announcement shattered into 1,000 individual calculations of survival. Gitsnatcher pulled Snotgob back into the relative safety of their alley, his mind racing. A free-for-all. No alliances, no rules. It was a death sentence wrapped in the guise of entertainment. He was strong, but he was not the biggest, not by a long shot. He saw the hulking brutes already flexing, their simple minds seeing only the meat and the glory. He saw the cunning ones like Snotgob, whose eyes darted around, already looking for the weakest points in the coming storm. "We stick today, edges," Snotgob whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Let the big uns smash each other first. We find a corner, put our backs to it. You smash anything that comes close. I'll watch your back." It was a strategy of desperation. A plan to survive the initial chaotic bloodbath by being a slightly harder target than the orc next to them. But Gitsnatcher felt a profound doubt settle over him, cold and heavy. This wasn't a brawl over food or space. This was a culling. He looked at his own hands, then at the mountains of muscle and scar tissue that were his competition. He was a fighter, but in this meat grinder, he felt like a mere scrap of gristle. His chances were slim to none. A fact had sat in his gut like a stone. He was not being given a choice. Not really. Crump's decree was absolute. To refuse was to be fed to the squigs. A death even more meaningless than one in the brawl. He was trapped, a pawn in the warden's violent game, forced to join a spectacle where his only role was to be a splash of color in the inevitable red finale. He picked up a heavy rust-cake gear from the dirt, its weight a pathetic counterbalance to the dread building inside him. He was going into the scrap heap, and he was almost certain he wasn't coming out. The bell was not a ring but a detonation, the shriek of a tortured metal sheet being struck by a sledgehammer. The sound tore through the yard, and for a single, suspended heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the world erupted. The scrap heap was no longer a place but a living entity, a single roaring beast composed of 1,000 individual acts of violence. Gitsnatcher was swallowed by it instantly. The tide of green flesh and flashing iron, sweeping him away from the relative safety of the alley mouth. The air vanished, replaced by a solid wall of sound, the roar of engines some orcs had inexplicably started, the clash of metal, the wet thuds of impacts, and the endless, mindless bellows of combat. His plan to stick to the edges evaporated like mist. There were no edges, only the churning center. A massive orc with a spiked helmet barreled past him, trampling a smaller combatant to the mud without breaking stride. Gitsnatcher ducked under a wild swing from a chain flail, the rusted links whistling inches from his ear. This was not about winning. This was about not dying in the next 5 seconds. He moved not with brute force, but with a desperate animal cunning, letting the larger currents of the brawl carry him, using the bigger, slower orcs as living shields. He was a piece of debris in a hurricane. His survival depended on not resisting the storm, but flowing with its deadliest currents. He saw his chance, not in an attack, but in a moment of distraction. A hulking brute named Scragjaw, known for his collection of trophies taken from the fallen, had just finished pounding an opponent into a pulp. As Scragjaw stood over his victim, bellowing his triumph the uncaring sky. A grisly necklace of threaded fingerbones swung loose from his neck. It was a minor prize, a trinket, but in this world of absolute deprivation, it was a symbol of status, a tiny spark of victory.
While Scragjaw was busy roaring, Gitsnatcha acted. He didn't charge. He dropped to his belly in the churned, bloody muck and slithered forward like a snake, using the legs of other brawling orcs for cover. The stench was overwhelming, the risk of being stomped flat immense, but he was invisible down here in the foot-level chaos. He reached Scragjaw's massive tree-trunk legs. With one swift, precise motion, he hooked a dirty fingernail under the leather cord of the necklace and yanked. The cord, weakened by grime and old sweat, snapped. Gitsnatcha closed his, fished around the small, bony trophy and rolled away, back into the forest's stomping boots. He didn't stop until he found a momentary pocket of space behind a collapsed pile of engine blocks. His chest heaving, he unclenched his fist. The finger bones, yellowed and crude, lay in his palm. It was nothing. It was everything. A hot, fierce flicker of pride ignited in his chest. He had done it. He had outsmarted a bigger, stronger orc. He had taken something, however small, in this arena of pure taking. For a glorious second, he wasn't just surviving. He was winning. A hand grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. It was Snotgob, his face a mask of mud and panic. The smaller orc's eyes darted from the trophy and Gitsnatch's hand to his face, and he shook his head violently, his expression not of congratulations but of warning. Snotgob's gaze was a bucket of cold water dashed over Gitsnatch's brief triumph. He pointed a trembling finger back toward where Scragjaw was now, having discovered his loss. The brute was in a frothing rage, smashing his fists into the ground, and any orc unfortunate enough to be nearby, roaring Gitsnatch's name into the din. The pride in Gitsnatch's chest curdled into a leaden dread. He hadn't won a thing. He had merely painted a target on his own back, one that was now being sought by a monster with a very long memory. The minor victory felt hollow, a shiny bauble that had just made him infinitely more interesting to the things that wanted to crush him. Snotgob's silent, terrified stare said it all. It wouldn't last. The brief flicker of light only made the encroaching darkness that much deeper. The idea of escape was a madness that grew in the dark, fertile soil of desperation. It began not as a plan, but as a whisper, a shared glance between Gitsnatcha and Snotgob in the grimy aftermath of the scrap heap. The memory of Scragjaw's roaring fury was a fresh brand on Gitsnatcha's mind, a constant reminder that his minor victory had only bought him a more prominent place on the prison's menu. They couldn't fight their way to the top. The ladder was too slick with blood and populated by brutes like Crump. So, their minds, in a rare moment of synchronized, orky ingenuity, turned to the one direction no one ever looked, down. Their tools were a testament to their new purpose, stolen and daring, fumbling raids on the guards' neglected scrap piles. Gitsnatcha had wrested a heavy, blunt-ended pry bar from a sleeping bully, while Snotgob had liberated a dented shovel-head with no handle. The handle was fashioned from the splintered leg of a broken stool, lashed on with strips of grimy cloth. It was a pathetic arsenal for such an ambitious undertaking, but to them it represented a sliver of hope, a crack in the absolute reality of their cage. They chose their digging site with all the strategic foresight typical of their kind. A shadowy alcove behind the reeking latrine trench where the stench was so overpowering it kept even the guards at a distance. The ground was soft, waterlogged, and foul, but it was out of sight. That was the entirety of their planning. On the first night, they fell upon the earth with a frenzy born of pure, undiluted optimism. Gitsnatcha drove the pry bar into the muck, levering out clods of wet soil, while Snotgob scrambled to shovel the debris into a stolen sack. For a few glorious hours they were not prisoners. They were architects of their own destiny,
their grunts and heaves a symphony of rebellion.
But Ork cooperation's a fragile thing. A delicate bubble, destined to be popped by the sharp point of a disagreement. The trouble began on the third night, deep in the narrow, claustrophobic shaft they had carved. The tunnel was barely wide enough for Gitsnatcher's broad shoulders, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and their own fear sweat. We should go down more. Gitsnatcher grunted, straining to force the pry bar into a particularly stubborn layer of compacted clay. His plan was simple, direct, and brutish. Dig straight down until they hit something, then dig straight out. Depth equaled progress. Snotgob, who was crammed behind him trying to shovel in the oppressive dark, shook his head, his voice a reedy whine in the confined space. No, that's the wrong way. We gotta go sideways, slanty-like. Down is Ada. Sideways is sneaky. It was a debate of profound geological and tactical ignorance. Gitsnatcher, his muscles aching and his patience frayed by the stubborn earth, saw Snotgob's objection as a challenge to his authority, a ghost of his failed leadership rising to haunt him. He stopped digging and turned as much as the tunnel would allow, his eyes glinting in the near-total darkness. I'm digging. So, we go down. He snarled, his voice echoing dully in the cramped hole. But it's stupid, Snotgob squealed back, his own frustration boiling over. We'll hit water, or rock. We'll be stuck. The argument escalated from a hissed disagreement to a full-throated, if muffled, shouting match there in the bowels of the earth. They were no longer a team with a shared goal. They were two orcs in a hole, each convinced the other was a git of monumental proportions. Gitsnatcher, in a fit of pique, slammed his pry bar into the tunnel wall to emphasize his point, dislodging a shower of dirt and pebbles. Snotgob, in retaliation, kicked at the pile of excavated earth, sending a wave of muck over Gitsnatcher's legs. It was this final, petulant act that sealed their fate. The kick destabilized the loose pile of dirt they had been using to shore up the tunnel's entrance. A low groan emanated from the earth around them, a deep, ominous sound that cut through their anger instantly. They both froze, their quarrel forgotten. A trickle of dirt became a stream, then a cascade. The splintered stool leg handle of Snotgob's shovel snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Then the roof gave way. It was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, inevitable subsidence. The walls sighed inward, and the world became a roaring, suffocating avalanche of dark, wet soil. Gitsnatcher had a final absurd image of Snotgob's wide, terrified eyes before a torrent of earth smashed into him, driving the air from his lungs and pinning him in a cold, crushing embrace. The tunnel, their grand avenue to freedom, their masterpiece of hope, collapsed upon itself with a sound like a wet, heavy blanket being dropped. In the sudden, absolute silence that followed, buried under a ton of prison filth, the farcical nature of their endeavor was complete. Their hope had not been crushed by a guard's maul or a rival's fist, but by their own glorious, spectacular incompetence, turning a dream of escape into just another layer of dirt in the pit. The only thing more dangerous than Big Boss Crump's boredom was his sudden, fleeting interest. It struck without warning, a capricious storm on a stagnant sea. The collapse of Gitsnatcher and Snotgob's tunnel had left them half-buried and thoroughly demoralized, caked in mud that felt like a second skin of failure. They had just clawed their way out of the debris, spitting dirt and shame when the rhythmic pounding began again. This time it was different. Not the chaotic drumming of the scrap heap, but a slow, deliberate hammer on anvil beat that spoke of ceremony or the orcish approximation of it. Crump stood on his days, his hydraulic claw holding aloft, not a corpse, but a crudely forged circlet of jagged iron and wire-together teeth. DA Boredom is back, he announced, his voice a landslide of gravel. But this time we's doing it proper.
WIV, Fins. He gestured with the circlet.
A duel! A tournament!
1-on-1. Winner gets this or that.
And a whole day without getting. Corrupt, Loser gets fed to my new pet, Squig. The yard, still buzzing from the recent tunnel fiasco, erupted in a fresh wave of agitation.
This was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was a structured, almost civilized form of violence, which made it infinitely more terrifying. The guards waded into the crowd, not to crump randomly, but to select.
Their criteria was simple. Anyone who looked like they could provide a good show. Gitsnatcher, still covered in the evidence of his failed ambition, tried to shrink into the shadows.
It was futile. A massive hand clamped down on his shoulder, the grip of a guard named Gutstomper.
You, Gutstomper grunted, his breath a foul cloud of rotting meat. Da boss saw you in the scrap heap.
He says you's got spunk, you's fightin'. There was no appeal. It was a death sentence delivered with a bored shrug. Gitsnatcher was hauled toward a cleared circle in the center of the yard, the packed earth stained dark with old blood. The duels were short, brutal, and decisive. Ork after ork was pitted against one another, their fights a blur of swinging fists, headbutts, and the sickening crack of bone.
Gitsnatcher's first opponent was a hulking brute with a cleaver for a hand. Gitsnatcher
won not through skill, but through a combination of brute force and sheer dumb luck. He charged low, taking a deep gash across his shoulder, but managed to tackle the brute off balance. They landed in a heap, and Gitsnatcher's forehead connected squarely with the other orc's nose, shattering it with a wet crunch. The brute went limp.
Gitsnatcher stood, blood streaming from his shoulder, surprised to be alive. His next fight was against a faster, more cunning opponent who used a length of chain like a whip.
Gitsnatcher stumbled backward, the chain lashing his chest and arms, each strike raising a bloody welt. He was losing, being herded toward the edge of the circle where a loss was certain.
Then his foot caught on a half-buried rock, a piece of debris from some forgotten brawl. He fell hard, and the chain-wielder, overconfident, lunged for the kill. As Gitsnatcher fell, his flailing hand closed around the rock. He swung it upward in a blind, desperate arc. It connected with the leaping. Ork's jaw with a sound like a dropped anvil. The orc dropped out cold. Luck! Again! Somehow, through a series of clumsy, violent encounters where his raw strength barely outweighed his opponent's and fortune seemed to tilt the scale, Gitsnatcher found himself in the final. His last opponent was a mountain of scarred muscle named Bone Chewer, who had torn through his own bracket with methodical savagery. The fight was a one-sided beating. Gitsnatcher was punched, kicked, and thrown around the circle like a rag doll. He was on his last legs, his vision swimming, his body a single throbbing ache. Bone Chewer reared back for a final skull-splitting blow, and he slept. His boot slid on a patch of mud churned up by their struggle. It was a microscopic lapse, a flaw in the universe, but it was all Gitsnatcher needed.
With the last of his strength, he drove his shoulder into Bone Chewer's chest, sending the bigger orc stumbling backward over his own feet. Bone Chewer fell, his head striking the same
half-buried rock that had saved Gitsnatcher earlier. He did not get up. Silence. Then, a slow, grinding laugh from the days. Crump was leaning forward, his single red eye fixed on Gitsnatcher. There was no admiration in that gaze, but a spark of sharp, predatory interest. He had not seen skill. He had seen a survivor, a Git who kept stumbling into victory.
He tossed the jagged circlet.
It landed in the mud at Gitsnatch's feet. The promised reprieve was a tangible, almost dizzying sensation. For one day, no one would challenge him. The guards looked away as he limped past.
The other prisoners gave him a wide berth. He had earned a bubble of temporary safety.
But as he clutched the crude champion's crown, the feeling was hollow. He hadn't won.
He had simply failed to lose in the most dramatic way possible, and high on his scrap metal throne, Big Boss Crump watched him go, that spark of interest still glowing in his eye like a lit fuse.
The warden had found a new toy, and Gitsnatcher knew, with a cold certainty that seeped into his bones, that his temporary reprieve was merely the calm before a far more personal storm. The champion's circlet felt less like a crown and more like a brand, marking Gitsnatcher as both a survivor and a target.
The single day of reprieve passed in a surreal, silent bubble within the prison's constant roar. No one challenged him for his moldy fungus.
No guards accidentally shoved him into a wall. He could even sleep for a few consecutive hours without being used as a footstool. It was a taste of a different life, a cruel parody of the respect he had once commanded, and it made the return to normalcy all the more bitter. The moment the unofficial truce expired, the world snapped back to its violent equilibrium, and the circlet became just another piece of scrap, its power as fleeting as the memory of a full belly. It was in this renewed state of heightened alertness that Gitsnatcher first noticed the change in Snotgob. The smaller Ork had always been skittish, his eyes constantly darting like a cornered rodent, but now a new tension coiled within him. He was distracted during their scavenging, his gaze drifting not toward potential threats, but toward a particular corner of the yard where a new mob had recently coalesced.
They were the Skull Threshers, a brutal crew led by a hulking brute named Gorbash, who distinguished himself in the duel tournament by tearing an opponent's arm off and beating him to death with it. They were growing fast, absorbing smaller, weaker orcs through a combination of intimidation and the promise of slightly better scraps.
Snotgob watched them with a look that was not fear, but calculation. The betrayal, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, sickening realization.
Gitsnatcher had been gathering rusty nails, a pathetic currency, but currency nonetheless. From a pile of debris, he turned, expecting to see Snotgob keeping watch, and found empty space. A cold prickle ran down his spine. He scanned the chaotic yard and found him.
Snotgob was standing at the fringes of the Skull Threshers, not as a prisoner, but as a supplicant. He was holding out Gitsnatcher's small, hard-won stash of nails to Gorbash himself.
The massive orc took the offering, grunted, and gave a curt nod.
Snotgob scurried to stand behind him, melting into the mob.
He did not look back. The rage that filled Gitsnatcher was a white-hot, pure thing, burning away all thought and strategy.
It was a deeper, more personal hurt than any beating. The tunnel's collapse had been incompetence. This was a choice.
He did not shout or charge. He simply began to walk, his heavy footfalls a dead march through the churning crowd, his eyes locked on the traitor.
The other orcs, sensing a different kind of violence in the air, a personal storm amidst the general chaos, parted to let him pass. He stopped a dozen paces from the Skull Threshers.
He ignored Gorbash, ignored the leering, armed brutes at his side. His
gaze was only for Snotgob. He pointed a thick, trembling finger.
"You," Gitsnatcher growled, the word a low rumble of tectonic plates shifting. For a moment Snotgob looked genuinely afraid, the old terror flashing in his eyes. Then, emboldened by the wall of green muscle at his back, he puffed out his scrawny chest.
"What?"
"With you, I'm just get what gets crump first. Here, I'm with the big uns."
He gestured to Gorbash, who watched the exchange with bored amusement, as if observing two insects fighting over a crumb. That was all the invitation Gitsnatcher needed. He roared, a raw, gut-deep sound of shattered trust, and charged. He wasn't aiming for Gorbash. This was not a challenge for leadership. This was personal. He bulldozed straight through the front line of the mob, his shoulder catching Snotgob square in the chest and lifting him from his feet. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, a tiny, violent island in the sea of the skull-threshers. The fight was not a contest of skill. It was a savage, close-quarters bludgeoning. Gitsnatcher's fists were hammers, pounding down on Snotgob's face and body, each impact a punctuation mark to a sentence of betrayal. Snotgob, desperate and wiry, scratched and bit, his nails clawing bloody furrows down Gitsnatcher's arms. But the difference in raw power was absolute. Gitsnatcher was lost in a red haze, his world narrowed to the feel of bone and flesh yielding under his knuckles. He did not see the signal from Gorbash. He only felt the world explode in agony as a heavy boot, belonging to one of the threshers, slammed into his ribs. Another caught him in the back of the head, making his vision swim with white stars. The mob closed in, not to help Snotgob, but to partake in the crumping. Fists and boots descended upon Gitsnatcher from all sides, a rain of casual brutality. He tried to rise, to fight back against this new wave of enemies, but a well-aimed kick to his knee sent a bolt of lightning up his leg, and he collapsed. Through a haze of pain and the forest of stomping boots, he saw Snotgob scrambling away, bloody but alive, helped to his feet by his new comrades. They were laughing. The betrayal was complete, and it was profitable. Gitsnatcher curled into a ball, protecting his head as best he could. The physical pain a dull echo compared to the lesson being carved into his soul. He had trusted. He had formed an alliance, however shaky. He had believed in some deep, foolish part of himself that shared survival could be a bond. As the blows continued to fall, turning his body into a single, throbbing wound, the last of that foolishness was beaten out of him. Trust was a weapon you handed to your enemy. Loyalty was a story told by the soon-to-be dead. In the prison's savage culture, the only thing more futile than hope was the belief that you weren't in the pit alone. He learned it there in the dirt, as his own blood pooled in the mud where a friend used to stand. The beating at the hands of the skull threshers was a crucible, burning away the last remnants of the Ork Gitsnatcher had been. The physical wounds knitted together into a lattice of tough, knotted scars, but the internal change was far more profound. The cold, hard lesson of Snotgob's betrayal settled in his gut, not as a wound, but as a new foundation. Trust was a liability. Compassion was a death sentence. The only language this world understood was violence, and he decided, with a grim and final resolve, to become fluent. It began not with a grand declaration, but with a slow, deliberate turn. He stopped shrinking from the casual brawls that defined the yard. He started seeking them out. His first target was a minor bully named Ripper, who had made a habit of stealing Gitsnatcher's mold rations. Before, Gitsnatcher would have grumbled and surrendered the fungus. Now, he saw the challenge for what it was, a rung on a ladder. When Ripper lumbered over, his hand outstretched in expectation, Gitsnatcher did not hand. Over the mold, he met the bully's gaze, his own eyes flat and cold. Confusion flickered across Ripper's face, then irritation. He threw a lazy, telegraphed punch. Gitsnatcher didn't block it. He let it graze his cheek, and in that split second of his opponent's overextension, he moved. He drove his forehead into the bridge of Ripper's nose, felt the cartilage snap,
then grabbed the stunned orc by the neck and slammed his face repeatedly into the nearest rusted wall until the body went limp. He left Ripper in a heap and took his mold, along with a chipped but serviceable metal knuckle duster from his belt.
The victory was small, but its effect was seismic. Other orcs, the ones who lurked at the bottom of the pile, took notice.
They saw the cold efficiency, the lack of triumphant roaring, the simple, brutal finality of it. A few of them, a one-eyed git named Gloomfang and a hulking, simple-minded brute called Thud, started drifting closer to him during the chaotic scrambles for food.
They didn't speak of allegiance. They just positioned themselves near him, a silent acknowledgement that his shadow was, for the moment, a slightly safer place to stand. His next challenge was more audacious.
He targeted one of Gorbash's skull threshers, a lieutenant named Snaggletooth, who had particularly enjoyed kicking him while he was down. Kit Snatcher didn't confront him in the open. He waited, patient as a landslide, until Snaggletooth was isolated, relieving himself in the reeking latrine trench. Git Snatcher emerged from the shadows, the stolen knuckle duster adding a sickening crunch to his first blow.
The fight was short, vicious, and utterly one-sided. When it was over, Git Snatcher didn't just walk away. He took Snaggletooth's spiked shoulder guard and fixed it to his own, a grisly trophy and a direct insult to Gorbash and his entire mob. With each victory, his following grew.
It wasn't a loyal mob, not in any sense he remembered from the outside. It was a collection of survivors,
Drawn to the scent of rising power like mangy squigs to a carcass. They were Gloomfang, Thud, and a handful of others. A ragged, desperate band that fought with a new, chilling coordination when Git Snatcher pointed them at a target. He gave them no speeches, no promises of glory. He gave them direction, and in return, they gave him a buffer against the chaos, a wall of flesh between him and the next would-be challenger.
And as his status grew, a disquieting thought began.